Hello, this is Mark Tooley, President of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, here in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure of speaking with my friend, human rights scholar Aaron Rhodes. He'll be discussing his just released new book, Human Rights Without Illusions Escaping the Moral Trap of Universalism. Aaron, it's great to see you, and tell us why you wrote this book.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me on your show. I wrote the book because as an effort to understand why the international human rights system is the way it is. I've been concerned about problems with international human rights for, well, it's maybe around the past 15 years. And uh, as you know, I published a book in 2018 in which I talked about the meaning of human rights and how so much of international human rights today is concerned with economic and social rights, and how that has um, had a negative effect on the protection of fundamental freedoms. And around the time I finished the book, I started thinking about the international human rights system. So it's approaching it from a different angle and wondering why there's such a determination to approach the protection of human rights through global institutions and through inclusive global institutions. And this led me slowly toward the theme of my book, which is the idea of universalism and the different ways in which the moral obligations that obtain from universality approach the way we deal with human rights. And I think does that answer your question?
Yes, it
How I
does.
got started?
And for the benefit of viewers, how do you define human rights?
I define human rights as natural rights, which are inherent and universal. They are, and I don't even know if using the word rights is even adequate, but all human beings can only fulfill their potential and their moral personalities unless they're free of coercion in thought and in uh, with whom they associate, and with regard to how they conduct themselves with respect to sacred questions. So those are the main human rights, and there can be discussions about what that includes or what that doesn't include. But I'm a classical liberal in my thinking. I think I'm also an admirer of Immanuel Kant, and I think I agree with him that the only really uh, uh, inherent right is the right to freedom.
And so you and I think most people in traditional human rights would look at America's Bill of Rights and see that as a helpful summary of basic liberties that should be safeguarded.
Yes, I do. I do. I think that there are misunderstandings about what was meant, and the language has changed. We don't understand what they meant by property rights, first of all. Um, we think this means something, you pick up and take home with you, something material. But property rights, the founders thought of property rights in the same way that John Locke did, that property means yourself.
Hmm.
And yourself is your property and to do with as you wish. So yes, I do, I think especially as this society is thinking about its founding now in the context of the anniversary and so on, it would be very helpful to focus again on the idea of natural rights, and to maybe and to rededicate ourselves to the idea of natural rights as the founders did.
And so most people, in understanding the original perspective of human rights, would see that this is a simplistic summary is essentially I can be left alone with my own beliefs to live as I choose without molestation by society or by the state. But a more expansive view of human rights has developed over the last 50 years. Tell us about that.
Well, that's a long story, and it's not just over the last 50 years, because uh, the human rights system reflects a desire to uh, for a world of nations and societies that all adhere to the same moral uh, uh, obligations. And this comes from ancient Greek philosophy. It comes from the idea of natural law. And in my book, I try to make a kind of, and it's, I'm embarrassed a little bit by uh, being one of these people that tries to summarize world history in a couple of hundred pages. But I talked about the Stoic philosophers and how the early Stoic philosophers, in particular, um, looked for commonalities with people in other societies, and they tried to live in harmony with natural law. They saw this as our obligation, and but they understood that there was something universal about all people, that all people shared certain qualities, and that that gave men and women a connection to people outside of their own society. And they saw this universalism in moral terms. And I think somewhere uh, there was a change occurred, and especially with the expansion of the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. But it began to when the rulers began to conquer nearby lands and subject them to the same, or try to bring them into harmony, bring them into a political unity, then the idea of universalism changed, and it became an institutional and political universalism, and empires grew out of this. And it entered into the Christian religion as a structure, so that the Christendom was an attempt to bring nations together uh, under common uh, moral beliefs and practices and rules. Um, um, and so this was basically the framework of international human rights, as I have tried to explain. The mental framework of international human rights we have inherited from the model of Christendom, I believe. And in fact, it's quite explicit. It's not just a speculation, because if you study the origins of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the influence of Catholic thinkers was very strong, and they saw the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a moral constitution of the world. And at the same time, they sought consensus. So the purpose of the United Nations was to bring nations together, and so the question of human rights became um, merged with the question of consensus and unity and peace. Um, when they tried to sell the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to in 1948, tried to market the idea among nations, they Jacques Maritain came up with strategy of not talking about the meaning of human rights, not talking about the foundations of human rights, but just working with a list of human rights. We don't bother with, let's not get into any arguments, he said. And so this is this is called a great moral achievement by Jacques Maritain. But the result is that you have agreement on a declaration without any underlying philosophical consensus, without any underlying philosophical beliefs. And it's a kind of frosting on a cake that has a lot of diverse elements within it. And I know that today, when you talk about, maybe questioning the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or questioning the very validity of something like international human rights law, you're treated as a kind of heretic. And I think this has given me a kind of cue because it is seen as a religious structure. And I think I'm a follower of Max Weber, well, that sounds like something religious unto itself. But I mean, I have studied very closely the past Weberian sociology and the sociology of other people like Rudolf Zohm and church historians. And I think these patterns have entered into the development of international human rights. And so that today, international human rights is a kind of church. And it has become, it resembles the problems that occurred with the medieval church. There are actors in international human rights that don't believe in human rights. There are corrupt actors. And there are actors that use international human rights to legitimate themselves and moralize themselves in the in the eyes of the world. And the result is something that is not doing justice to really what we Americans or should think about as natural rights. Natural rights is an idea that was clarified in the Enlightenment, especially by John Locke. And John Locke didn't have any use for the notion of something like a global governance. He thought that the international society isn't really a society at all. It's a state of nature where the actors don't act as moral individuals; they act as states that pursue their interests. And so we have in international human rights a kind of agglomeration of the idea of natural rights and this institutional unity demand being jammed together, and I don't think it's working so well. And I'm especially concerned about civil society because, as you know, Mark, I'm a human rights activist over the past 30 years or so, and I see the civil society human rights community wasting a lot of time on reports and trying to make very minimalistic changes in declarations and all feeding into this bureaucratic UN system or the regional institutions of the UN, like the OSCE or the OAS. And I see them, and I don't see this having much effect. And I think so. I think the international legal human rights system has the effect of draining off the energy of civil society with the illusion of reform. But it hasn't worked so well, and I don't see very many nations being reformed by international human rights. I see very many nations legitimating unfree practices and oppression in the name of human rights.
So human rights have been expanded by this international lobby or regime, if you want to call it, to include not just freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association, but economic rights, environmental rights,
Yeah.
rights, a right to affirmation for one's own choices. Is that accurate?
Yes, there's a lot of lawyers, including in the American Bar Association, that are always lobbying for more treaties. And it's a kind of jobs program for lawyers in many respects. There's a tremendous sort of inclination toward proliferation coming from a number of different directions, but especially from the human rights community itself. They're very often in more high level officials appointed, more special rapporteurs appointed, more in addition to more laws. And the whole thing, as I mentioned, Max Weber is like building up into something that is quite dysfunctional because of this increasing rationalization of the idea of human rights. I think we have to put the morality, we have to think about human rights basically as moral rights and campaign for them as moral rights. And when you speak about a human rights violation, it's a lot more persuasive to say that it's a violation of nature or of God's will than it is to say, well, that's a violation of such and such treaty, which is a product of international negotiations. It's a kind of positive law as opposed to natural law.
And,
I know the implications of this are very unpleasant, and difficult, and I'm kind of like barking at the moon with my ideas, but this is what I've come up with.
and in reaction to all of this, you have, in some ways, a global pushback by nationalism and tribalism who reject any concept of international human rights, correct?
Um, yes, I think that's true. It's not certainly a matter of, I don't think international human rights are very of much interest to, uh, populist uh, political movements. But yeah, I guess you're right.
I mean, I think they're disdainful of the concept. Many of them would even reject the idea of natural law. They're much more nation, tribe, religion focused, and would deny that there's anything that binds us together universally. Some of them would.
Yeah, I think it's hard to generalize. And I think that's a question mark that we should look into more closely because uh, I'm interested in learning more about these national and populistic political movements like the AfD in Germany and find and what do they believe about human rights? Nobody ever asks them.
Yeah.
Nobody ever talks to them. We have to talk to them and find out what they think and share perspectives and but not just push them away.
So to recapture a healthy notion of human rights, we have to root them in some philosophical and theological basis, which has largely been avoided for 60, 70, 80 years. How can we take that route?
Well, I think educational institutions should improve the way they teach about human rights, first of all. So when the human rights education, to the degree that I understand what it's all about, is largely positivistic in character. So it's a study of of treaties treaties and agreements and so on. It does not talk about the things that I've talked about. It doesn't talk about natural rights. It doesn't talk about classical Greek concept of natural law or any of these things that upon which the idea of human rights that furnish the idea of human rights. And so um, I have been going to human rights conferences and seminars for decades, and I don't think I've ever heard the words natural law.
Hmm.
And That's one thing. And I think by the same token, to, you know, to get the American political system back on course, we have to look at these concepts. We have to immerse ourselves in these concepts and speak about them and question the direction of things.
And for those who are not religious in a traditional sense, looking for a foundation upon which to base their concept of human rights, is that foundation going to be the Stoics and the philosophy of antiquity, or what is the basis?
It's in natural rights,
Yeah.
because natural rights, as the word implies, um, are based in nature, and so I don't think you have to think about natural law as a matter of divine commands. You need to think about it as laws that are the idea that uh, men and women inherently have as part of their constitution certain an affinity, certain moral ideas, and I don't think that's so difficult to grasp for somebody that says they don't believe in God.
Aaron, could you hold up a copy of your book?
Yes, I could. Thank you. Here it is.
Human Rights Without Illusions, Escaping the Moral Trap of Universalism by Aaron Rhodes. Aaron, thank you so much for this informative conversation.
Thank you for having me, Mark.